This is Devin Graves coming to you once again from Studio D, this time with part 3 of my epic home recording series, Old School Production in the Modern Age. And today we're going to talk about how to use the analog workflow to understand any DAW. For this video, I'm seated in front of my old trusty Mackie analog 8-bus mixing console, and my aim is to get you to understand how any DAW works based on understanding the flow of an analog system. There's going to be a little more to it than just the analog system because we also have sequencing, and I'm going to get into that when we discuss the sequencer. But when you combine these two systems together, you get all the workings, all the terminology, all the signal flow, everything what is found in the DAW. So let's get started. We'll start at the top section of the console. And what you'll see is going to be reminiscent of anything you see on a basic audio interface. It starts with the microphone preamps up on top, the XLR inputs. Just below those, you'll see the 1/4-inch line inputs, often found combined in the same jack on an audio interface. Below that you see the direct out, which you won't see on an audio interface, but basically the direct out will correspond track for track. The mixing console will hook up directly to a multi-track tape deck. And if you have a 16-track or 24-track tape deck, you can hook up the direct outs, channel 1 to track 1 on the tape deck, and so forth, all the way up to as many tracks as you have. I used to use a 16-track tape deck. The outputs of the multi-track tape recorder would come to tape returns that can't be seen here. They're actually on the back of the desk, but each channel has an additional input called tape return, and the tape tracks would return to the desk. In my case, tracks 1 through 16 from the tape deck back to the mixing console. Up here you would see a switch that would select between the mic and line input or the tape input. There's one more jack you'll see on the bottom row that says insert. Now that is both a send and a return that goes on the same cable. It uses a stereo cable on one end, the end that goes into the console, and then it splits out to two mono 1/4-inch plugs, which will go into the input and the output of a compressor, an EQ, anything you want to insert into the channel. By inserting something into the channel itself, you actually alter the signal on the channel itself. So if I was recording, whatever I plugged into that insert would end up on my recording, and if I'm mixing, whatever is plugged into that insert would end up on the mix of that channel. You'll see inserts on the DAW as well, and you can see them here. Of course, on the DAW, I have 5 different insert slots, or 10, and different DAWs have a different amount of inserts, which you can insert many different plugins that will directly affect the track itself. That is called serial processing. So there's 2 kinds of processing. There's serial processing and parallel processing. Serial processing is what happens when you have something directly in line on the channel, such as what goes through an insert or the EQ section of the console, which we will get to. But anytime you have something inserted in the channel, it's going to permanently affect whatever is on that track. If I'm recording, it's going to be printed that way. If I'm mixing, it's going to affect that channel. Everything that comes through that channel, everything that's on that track is going to be affected by whatever is on that insert. Now, let's go to the bottom of the console and we'll work our way up. So the first thing you see is these row of faders. Okay, you're going to see the faders. It's going to look familiar to anybody that has a DAW. You'll have these faders represented quite literally in the DAW itself. Also, you can access them by way of a DAW controller, which you will have actual hands-on access to faders in your DAW, just like I have here on the console. Now we're going to move on to some certain terminologies which you will find in every DAW, something that actually is used interchangeably. The word bus and the word aux is something that they use pertaining to the same signal path mechanism, but on a mixing console there is a distinct difference, and I'll explain. First, we'll start with the buses. You see here, left, right, mix. That is the main output, the main stereo bus of the mixing console, also of your DAW. So the sum of all of these channels is going to be routed. In this case, if I push this button, or in the case of the DAW, that the output is selected to the left-right bus, everything that is mixed on these channels will be summed together at the mixing bus. That is your mix. It's important to understand that a mixing console in its first job is to take any series of inputs, be it microphone inputs, tape recorder inputs, signal coming into the mixer, to mix them and then route them to various outputs, be it the stereo bus output, or be it auxiliary outputs, or direct outputs, or headphone outputs, main speaker outputs. All of these different outputs are accessed through the mixer, and anything that goes into the mixer can be blended and sent to any various outputs, and we're going to get to those as well. Now we're going to continue on to buses because this is the first set of outputs that we're going to discuss. So if you look at each fader, you'll see each fader has a button here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and of course the main left, right. Now, the reason we have these additional buses, and they come back to the console here, 1 through 8, and then here's my stereo bus here. Now, when we were using mixing consoles and tape recorders, the mixing console could have a different amount of channels than the tape recorder. And in fact, in the early days when the Beatles were recording, they had only 4 tracks on their tape recorders. Of course, they mixed more mics together than they had tracks on tape. So what they would do is they would use these buses to combine a submix of these tracks, these channels, into smaller amounts of tape tracks. For example, if I had drums, 16 mics on the drums, say I had my kick, my snare top, snare bottom, tom, 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 overhead, overhead, hi-hat, ride, room mics, a stereo pair of room mics, however many I had. And right there I just listed 13, but say I had 13 microphones on the drums. And if I was working with a 16-track tape recorder, that would only leave me 3 tracks left. So what we would commonly do is we would bus these channels down to a more manageable amount of tracks. For example, if we had kick, snare, hi-hat, ride, tom, 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 overhead, overhead, room, room. Oh, this is the additional snare mic would have been, of course, down here. Doesn't matter how many tracks we use, but we want to use fewer tracks on our tape recorder so we have room for guitars and vocals and everything else. For example, we would assign our kick drum to bus 1, and by turning the pan all the way to the left, that would go to bus 1. If I panned it in the middle and I had bus 1 and 2, it would actually go equally to bus 1 and 2 in the middle. If I had it to the right, it would go to bus 2. So bus 1 for the kick, bus 2 for the snare, bus 2 for the snare bottom. So let's say our hi-hat, we would go bus 3 and 4, and our ride. So the hi-hat would come out bus 3, bus 4. So we've got our kick, our snare bottom, hi-hat, ride. Now we have our toms. Let's say now that we're committing to a stereo pair of channels, we can set our pans how we would want them to be. We don't set them completely wide because, you know, that's actually not how we hear drums. We hear them a little more contained in the stereo field. So you're actually committing here, as are you committing your mix. And let's go to bus 5 and 6 for the toms, and then bus 7, 8 for the overheads. We'll say bus 7 and 8 also for the room mics. Looks like we got 14 channels here. Okay. Now, whatever we have with our pan, with our signal level, and with whatever is going on above, which we will get to, any EQ settings, anything that's in the inserts that I described, all of that stuff is going to get printed down onto these respective tracks that are assigned to our 8-bus outputs. I would have these 8 outputs here routed to the first 8 channels on a tape deck, and this would be the level, the master level of my kick. This would be the master level of both the snare top and bottom. These left and rights would be the hi-hat and ride. I would still have individual control over those in the mix. This would be the mix of the toms in stereo. So whatever I have would be committed to this stereo pair, so I have to be wise on my EQ decisions. And over here would be my overheads blended with my room mics in this particular instance. So that's what a bus is. A bus takes a mix of the channels and sends them to a respective output. We're going to get to octaves in a minute, but first we're going to go up the channel in order. So what you're also going to see is a mute switch on your DAW, which is going to temporarily silence whatever track you have muted. And the direct opposite is the solo switch, which will mute everything except the track that you've soloed. Then we have our pan knobs, which I described. This just pans the signal between the left and the right speakers. Having it in the center, it comes equally out of both speakers, and that will sound like it's coming in what we call the phantom center. Now above that, this is a mix B section. This is something used for a second mix, maybe if I'm recording a drummer and I could have my pans and my levels independent of my pans and levels set here, so that I could give him more or her more kick, more snare, less of this, more of that, whatever it may be. I can do a little submix here that doesn't affect my main mix. And now we go up, and this is the EQ section. Now an EQ will be placed on an insert of your DAW. You'll actually choose which EQ you want for every track, which makes it a lot more versatile than a standard mixing console. With this console, I'm just stuck with what I've got here. And there are limitations, that's for sure. Down here we have a low cut filter, which cuts everything below 75 hertz. That's used to get rid of room rumble or any unwanted low-end frequencies. Say if I'm recording acoustic guitar or electric guitar, I don't need anything that low, so I can just press that switch and it will filter that out and make my mix that much cleaner. Above that, we have our EQ in section. That's just a bypass for the EQ that we're about to discuss. So right now I'm going to play the song. It's called Angel in the Dark. There's actually a link in the description below if you want to check out that whole song. I made a video for it, and it's just something I did on my own. I did it with Pro Tools, and here it is. So basically I have my audio coming in from the DAW. I have 32 outputs on the DAW, so that's looking at the DAW as a 32 track tape recorder, and I have outputs, 32 outs going to the 32 ins, the 32 tape ins on this console, and I have it just spilled out to where my kick drum is on track 1, channel 1, my snare is on channel 2, my hi-hat and ride, these are my overheads on tracks 3 and 4. Then from 5 through 8 I have just some percussion And then track 9 is my bass. So let's look at the EQ with the bass, okay? First I have my 80 hertz. If I add 80 hertz, you can hear that fill out, right? Or likewise, I can cut it. For bass, I wouldn't be cutting necessarily. My high shelf is at 12K. If I just boost it all the way, you can hear the snap on the strings. I'll put that back down. Then we go up to the low mids. Let's say we can sweep anywhere from 40 hertz. I'll just boost it all the way. It's really low. All the way up to 3K. Or let's say I wanted to cut that frequency. Okay, so it's cut a little bit, cut a lot at about 200 hertz. I would never do that on bass, but. And then I got my upper mids here on the top. You can hear that's a boost of about 2.5K. This is 1K, a boost. This is a 12 dB boost. It's a massive boost. It's actually probably 18 dB. That's 5K. So you can hear what that's doing. So we've looked at the EQ section. You get a general idea of what that's doing. Now let's go on to the aux send section. Now, for the aux sends, each of these knobs is corresponding to an output called an auxiliary out on the console. And these can go to traditionally one of two different destinations. Either a monitor send, a headphone amp, and in which case you would have, for each track, a level that you could select, adjust, for your, say you have 4 different performers on stage, drummer, guitarist, bassist, and a vocalist, let's say. And for each of these knobs on each of these channels, you can send some of that signal into the monitor. And say, it could send them some kick drum, some snare, and so on. And then for the guitar player, I can send a different mix. Less snare, more kick, whatever it needs to be. Same for the bass player. Same for the singer. They get their own mix, and that is done here. And that's actually where this little button comes in. And this is something that's going to come up, is something called pre and post fader. Let me see if I can focus on that. If I push this in, I'm pre-fader, which means that this signal gets sent out regardless of where my fader is set. And for a monitor mix, that's actually what you want to do, because I want to be able to adjust my fader down below without adjusting the mix send that's going out. But there is another possible destination, which is a lot more common when it comes to recording and mixing. These auxiliary sends can go to the inputs of effect devices, something like these here. Now, these effect devices are going to give you reverb, delay, phase, flange, any number of different effects, and they take a single mono input in many cases. In most cases, you just take a mono input, and then you can take a stereo output from the back of the device and come to these auxiliary returns on the board. And what's going to happen is the signal is going to get sent from the channel into the effect, however much I assign it to do so, and then we'll come back onto these stereo channels. It could also come back onto these mixing channels. That's also commonly done, and that will give you additional equalization or even inserts or whatever for creative processing, whatever you like. Now I'll show you what that's going to sound like. I'm going to put the music back on, and I'll talk about this a little. Okay, so I have my lead vocal, and now I want to add an effect to it. So let's say I want to send it to this second device with a slapback echo. Okay, so that's what that's doing. It's sending the signal out into the effects device, and the return is coming back. Now, say for this other vocal, I want a reverb. The more you slip away. And let's say I'll change this. The closer I get to you. The more you slip away. Okay. You're fading out, please don't slip away. You're my angel. So on these two different vocal tracks, I have two different effects for each one. Now in a DAW, it's a lot more versatile than this. I have a limit to actually 6 auxiliary sends, 6 different effect devices I could use simultaneously. In the DAW, it's virtually unlimited. Okay, another thing that we talked about at the beginning of the video were the inserts. And as I said, on the DAW, your EQ is going to come in on an insert, affecting everything on the track. You can also put in the hardware form, I use my inserts for compression. Let's go back to the bass track and I'll show you what compression is basically doing. Compression is reducing the dynamic range. It takes the louder parts and you can turn them down, which allows you to turn the quiet parts up. And it lets the instrument or voice sit more consistently in the mix with less fader moves. So let me show you how that works on the bass guitar, for example. So what I've done is I've inserted my DBX 160. Let me get rid of that EQ that I have, or reduce it. You can see I have this is the output signal or the input signal. And then this is the compression level. Now by reducing the threshold, now you can see compression is happening. This is makeup gain. And what that does is, since the level is reduced by the amount you see here, it's actually going to be quieter overall unless I use makeup gain. So here's bypassed. This is active. You're fading out, please don't slip away. Now it's active. So that's what's happening. You can see the dynamic level is reduced. Let's fine-tune the threshold to where it's just barely giving me some compression. You know every word that I mean, girl. When I'm reaching out, but you're fading right now. The closer I get to you, the more you basically have this going on with my vocals as well. I have other compressors up here, but it would be a bit redundant to show you what I'm doing because this is not a mix tutorial. We'll get into more specifics and techniques as we get further into the series when we get into mixing. Also, sometimes when we get into tracking, this stuff is going to come in as well. Now, as I said, we wanted, if we're sending to a monitor send, we want to set our aux sends to pre-fader. Again, so that our adjustments on our main faders don't affect the mix that's coming out from those auxiliary sends. But if we're using them, as I just demonstrated with effect sends, you want them post-fader. That way everything you've done on the EQ, everything you've done on the inserts is also going through the effect. And when you reduce or lower the vocal or whatever instrument that's going into that effect, it's also going to appropriately reduce the what's getting sent into the reverb. Because if you have it set to post and you reduce the vocal, the reverb or effect level is going to stay the same. And that's going to change the ratio, the wet-dry ratio, reducing the dry vocal on the fader, but keeping the affected vocal at the same level. So you want to have it post-fader so that those work together proportionately, the effect and the wet and dry signal. Another time you might want to use pre-fader is if you're using compression parallel. That's a more advanced situation that we can talk about more in depth later, but just know that if you are using parallel compression, you want to use your auxiliary sends in pre-fader mode, because then you can use your send to drive the compressor as you like, and it won't change regardless of where you set your mix fader. Parallel compression is when you take a signal from the channel, send it to a compressor, and then have it come back on parallel tracks, parallel channels, where you can blend it into taste. That's a mixing move, and we'll talk more about that later. When you look at this mixing console, as I said, just about everything here is represented in your DAW either via software, via the hardware interface. The only thing that you won't see here are the record enable buttons. A mixing console doesn't have that. That would be something that is on the multi-track recorder, either on the recorder itself or on a remote control, and you arm the tracks for recording on the tape deck, and you do the mixing on the mixer. In a DAW, they're kind of merged, one in the same. Now, when it comes to the DAW, there's more than just audio recording. There's also something called sequencing. And this is what you're doing whenever you're programming drums, whenever you're doing any virtual instruments, synthesizers, anything that you're recording via MIDI, and it's playing back the MIDI signal, and the MIDI signal is then triggering the voicings that's in the plugin for your orchestral suite or whatever you're using. You're recording in MIDI, and that is done with a sequencer. We also used MIDI sequencers, samplers, and synthesizers in the old analog days, and this was my first DAW. This is an Ensoniq ASR10, and this is a sampler, a synthesizer, and a sequencer all in one. And how I used to use this was I would create a song much in the same way that we would do it now, by programming the drums first, maybe putting in some piano, some keyboards, or whatever. And this is an 8-track sequencer. Very archaic. Nowadays you have as many tracks as you want, but I could assign, say, we don't need that. I can assign, say, my drum module to track 1, my piano module to track 2, my orchestration module to track 3, and those could play back either by way of this keyboard itself or through MIDI through a tone module. This here was my Pro-cushion. This was a really high-end tone module in its day. The samples don't sound very good, but it was very, very fast with triggering, and there was no delay. That was a thing. Some of the other drum modules, there was a little delay between when you hit it and when the sound came out, and not with the Pro-cushion. It was very, very, very fast. It had 6 outputs, has 6 outputs, so you could assign your kick, snare, toms, and your overheads and cymbals to respective tracks similar to the bussing. I also had a Korg synthesizer, and between the Korg synthesizer and the Ensoniq ASR10, these are the sounds that you hear on the first 2 Dead Soul Tribe albums exclusively. You also hear some of these sounds on some of the earlier Psychotic Waltz records. This is what we used. Dan also had a Korg module that he used, so a lot of the Psychotic Waltz sounds came from his module. But Another Prophet song, all of those keyboard sounds that you hear came from actually the predecessor to the ASR10, which was called an Ensoniq ESP. And this ASR10 was a massive upgrade to that. And this is what you hear on the first 2 Dead Soul Tribe albums. Now, the reason why this is called virtual tracks and why this term has carried over into the DAW is if I had 16 tracks on my tape recorder, I could use my other 16 channels on the mixer to play back the MIDI sequence real time and blend them all together. It would require that I sacrifice one track on the tape deck, track 16, and I would, after I make my sequence, then I could hit record on track 16 of the tape machine and then press play on the sequencer, and then it would have my click track and everything there, and it would record a code, a MIDI code, along that track of the tape. And then when I rewind the tape, wherever I played the tape, it would sync up my sequencer to the tape recorded tracks in real time. So that I could have, say, tracks 17 through 23 be my drum module, and then 24 and 25 could be my piano. The EPS actually has 8 outs itself. 26 and 27 could be my Korg tone module, and so on, all the way to 32 tracks of virtual tracks, as it's called, these MIDI instruments that play parallel to the recorded instruments on the 16-track tape. That was very, very slick. That was something I used to do all the time. Now, on the album Strange Mind of Buddy Lackey, I did it in exactly that way. Then I sent the 16-track tape out to Germany and had that transferred to a 24-track, and on those remaining 8 tracks, they took away my my digital drums and replaced them with real drums. They eventually ended up replacing all the instruments with other instruments. That's a topic of another discussion. But that was how I did it. I would use the MIDI drums to create the song, to write the song, to demonstrate the song. I would do that for Psychotic Waltz all the time. That would give me a full picture of my song. And then Norm could learn the drum parts, for example, or Adele could learn the drum parts for Dead Soul Tribe, and then adapt them however, make them better, hopefully, and then play those tracks to tape. I hope I haven't forgotten anything, and I hope that you find this engaging and informative, and please please subscribe if you don't want to miss the rest of this series. I thank you for joining me on this journey, and I wish you happy recording. So, until the next one.